a magnet for some of the real movers and shakers in sustainable development today. We get to sit here all in one place, and they come to us, and that is a real treat. And right now, we've got three remarkable speakers to share their visions on sustainable futures with you all. And to introduce them, I have one of the most thoughtful advocates on sustainability in India over the past few years. Dr. Pradipto Ghosh is a distinguished fellow and director at TERI, and he's been a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change and a wide range of other hugely influential bodies in India and worldwide. So to introduce our keynote addresses of the evening, Dr. Ghosh, thank you.
Good afternoon. We have with us two distinguished speakers, His Excellency Mr. Kjell Magne Bondevik. He was Prime Minister of Norway during 1997 to 2000, and again in 2001 to 2005. And he has, of course, a long resume, which is with you in your folder. I won't introduce him, by reading out his resume, but suffice it to say that he is the president of the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights, and he will speak on resource management and good governance. May I request His Excellency Mr. Bondevik to take his seat. Our second speaker is His Excellency Dr. Bharat Jagdeo, and he has been President of Guyana for 12 years, from 1999 to 2011. That's a very long period of time. And he's an economist by profession, and he will speak on opportunities for developing countries in the context of climate change action, particularly with respect to the upcoming Paris Accord. So, Dr. Jagdeo, may I request you to take your seats? Now, both these topics, that is resource management and good governance, as well as the opportunities for developing countries in the context of climate change action, are extremely salient when we speak of sustainable development and climate change. And on the first, and both of them are extremely salient in current political discourse in India. So on the first, let me just say that unless natural resources, including energy, are priced to the actual user at their true opportunity costs, there will be wasteful use, and this will not conduce to sustainability. And in India, in recent years, we have seen how, for example, spectrum and coal, that these have been underpriced owing to essentially discretionary allocation processes, which is an example of poor governance. Of course, these have subsequently been rectified, but the rectification was after a great deal of political debate and indeed turmoil. On the second, let me give an example. Now, although this is an example from a particular industry, but I think the lesson is more broadly relevant, though of course, Dr. Jagdeo, I understand, will be speaking more on the transformative types of opportunities for developing country economies. But let me come to my example. Now, we all know that recycling is environmentally much more sustainable than production of resources from mined raw materials. And India, Bangladesh, and China have had a vigorous shipbreaking industry, which is very highly labor intensive, because to break a ship, you have to actually dismantle it bolt by bolt, cut it panel by panel, and carefully remove all the materials. But this industry yields a lot of valuable recycled materials: steel, glass, copper, plastic, rubber, and other materials. Now, the question arose some years ago as to whether this was socially sustainable, because a number of NGOs, activist NGOs, alleged that the workers in the process of shipbreaking were exposed to asbestos, which is a hazard for lung cancer. Now, they took this matter to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court set up an expert committee to carefully look into the truth of this assertion. And this expert committee found that essentially this assertion was unsubstantiated, though there were other risks faced by the workers, and these were then addressed through an action plan. And so after implementation of the action plan, the shipbreaking industry continues to prosper in India as well as Bangladesh and China, deals large quantities of recycled materials, and provides employment to many thousands. I will now give the floor to our speakers, and I request His Excellency Mr. Bonsevik to go first.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all congratulate the National Agenda. And as former Prime Minister, I know that is important in itself. A country that is blessed with valuable natural resources, as Norway is, faces many exciting opportunities, but also some demanding challenges. Several surveys have been conducted comparing the economic and democratic development in countries with significant deposits of natural resources with countries that have no or limited amounts of such resources. Surprisingly enough, these surveys show that countries without natural resources tend to have a better economic growth compared to countries with abundant natural resources. This negative relationship holds true even taking into account variables found to be important for economic growth, such as initial per capita income, trade policy, government efficiency, investment rates, and other variables. A sound, responsible management of natural resources involves, in my view, three main challenges. First, to ensure that revenues from these resources benefit the entire population. Two, to ensure that these resources are mined or extracted in accordance with responsible good management principles, locally, nationally, as well as globally. And three, to ensure that the resources are exploited in an environmental, sustainable way. Corruption is very often strongly associated with the extraction of natural resources. The money goes into the pockets of the financial or political elite rather than to improve living conditions for the benefit of the entire population. The temptation for people in various positions of trust to steal from the community values and resources is probably the same in all parts of the world. However, the lack of legislation and the absence of control of monetary flows are important reasons why corruption is so serious and widespread in many developing countries. In these countries, corruption is a major reason for the lack of economic development and makes it difficult to establish a well-functioning trade and industry. There is one powerful instrument to counter widespread corruption, namely keeping a maximum transparency connected to the significant cash flows that follow the extraction of natural resources. It should be an inevitable requirement that cash flows that emanate from taxes, signature bonuses, etc., should be monitored at every stage of the transfer chain, both in the states and the various companies' accounts. Due to lack of regulations and legislation, many countries have far too modest incomes from the exploitation of the country's natural resources. Knowledge transfer may also be limited because companies prefer to bring in their own people from outside rather than to train the country's own labor force. When money flows into the treasury, another danger is lurking: the temptation to pour too much money into the economy over a short time to meet basic needs for education, for health, infrastructure, and other important purposes. However, experience from unrestrained spending is scary. A sudden increase of foreign currency, appreciation of the exchange rate, inflation, and decreasing competitiveness in other exporting sectors. It is therefore so important to find a good balance between investment, consumptions, and savings. Taking into account that these resources have been built up and deposited over millions of years, there is another good reason why the exploitation should have a more long-term perspective. Namely, that it is not fair to deprive future generations their legitimate right to benefit from the country's natural resources. In Norway, the so-called government pension fund Global is saving for future generations. One day, the oil and gas will run out, also in our country. But the return on the fund will continue to benefit the Norwegian population. The Norwegian Pension Fund is today the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund. The fund's market value per January 2015 is 6,600 billion Norwegian crowns, or about 850 billion US dollar. The fund was set up to give the government room for maneuvering in fiscal policy should oil prices drop, as it's doing today, or the mainland economy contract. It also serves as a tool to manage the financial challenges of an aging population and an expected drop in petroleum revenues that will come sooner or later. The fund was designed to be investing for the long term, but in a way that made it possible to draw on its resources when required. One fundamental principle of Norwegian fiscal policy is the so-called budgetary rule, namely that the government can spend only the expected real return of the fund, estimated at 4% per year. This helps to phase the oil revenue into the economy gradually, and in this way avoid overheating of the economy. Spending only the return on the fund rather than eating into its capital also means that the fund will benefit future generations. As Prime Minister, I experienced that people in Norway demanded that we should use more of the fund for all good purposes, and some politicians in opposition joined their voices. And this was a real political challenge. It was not easy, especially when we were campaigning before an election, but it was necessary to oppose these popular demands and to act in a responsible way. A balanced and moderate production rate is also in better compliance with sustainable environmental and climate considerations. But by help of new technology, it is possible today to extract natural resources quickly and efficiently. Mining companies, oil companies, and other companies engaged in the extraction of natural resources will, for obvious business interests, push for the most efficient operation and optimum returns. However, key economic, social, and environmental considerations make it necessary for the authorities to regulate both the pace and how the operation should be organized from the search starts throughout the manufacturing process and ultimately to how the company will clean up after themselves when production ceases. Climate change and environmental degradation pose substantial threats to the living conditions and to the well-being of citizens of every country. These processes have the potential to undermine important gains in poverty alleviation, basic food and water supply, and human health, particularly in the most vulnerable developing countries. Though the poorest countries historically have been the least responsible for climate change, they face the most severe consequences of its effects. Therefore, any planned exploitation of natural resources has to go through a thorough assessment of positive and negative impacts such an exploitation would entail. A short-term economic gain cannot be balanced against the long-term serious and negative consequences for people and the environment. Obviously, natural resources do not always appear as a blessing for a country. Such resources can also be a source of serious, protracted conflicts. From Africa, we learn how poor nations with natural resources can experience intrastate conflicts between the government army and different rebel movements. Civil wars in Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Democratic Republic of Congo are all examples of conflicts that largely are fueled by greed for natural resources as a basis for economic and political power. A democratic political system will, in the longer perspective, in my view, be the best guarantee for a sustainable and responsible management of natural resources. Real democracy implies power sharing and transparency. The Oslo Center, where I am the founder and president, is running democracy assistance projects in several countries, contributing to develop democratic political institutions and processes and good governance. We see our efforts as a contribution to responsible management of natural resources. To conclude, there are plenty of temptations and pitfalls along the road to develop a responsible and just extraction of natural resources. But at the end of this road, a golden opportunity emerges to transform natural resources into economic growth and improved standard of living, covering to the benefit of all people on the precondition that it is environmental sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for this masterful overview of the ingredients of what is known as the curse of natural resources and how Norway has consciously, through enlightened policy, ensured that the natural resources endowment of Norway becomes not a curse but a blessing, and also that when we talk about it as a blessing, that it is a blessing also in terms of sustainability. Our next speaker is His Excellency Dr. Bharat Jagdeo, and as I said earlier, he will be speaking on opportunities for developing countries in the context of the upcoming Paris Accord on climate change.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, most of you would have been here for 2 days, and by now you would have heard quite a bit on the issue of climate change, and I don't want to repeat what most of you would have heard. Forgive me if some of the things that I have to say today in this theme, looking at opportunities and challenges for developing countries in the context of climate change, if it were to stray into another area or some of the topics yesterday, because I was supposed to be here yesterday, couldn't make it, so I guess they stuck me in this session. But I think the last time we came here, a year ago, many of us were speaking about the loss of momentum since Copenhagen. We were worried that although we have had intervening conference of parties, that we did not have enough momentum to lead to the type of agreement that we need at the global level that would put us on a trajectory to save the world. And so most of us now, I'm sure, can look back over the year and say that there have been some changes that lead us to be a bit more optimistic that in 2015, we may be able to get an agreement that may not fulfill all the ambitions that we have, an agreement that may not be the one that is ideal, but an agreement of some sort. And what are these things that have happened over the years, over the past year? We had lamented that the United States of America was not taking enough of a lead. In 1 year, we have seen President Obama using the EPA under the Clean Power Plan to mandate a cut in their greenhouse gas emissions at a nationwide level. We have heard him give a speech in his Congress on the State of the Union address saying, this is the biggest threat, climate change is the biggest threat to the future of mankind. We've seen him go to China, the APEC meeting, and work out a deal with China, with pledges made to cut the US greenhouse gases emission by 26-28% by 2025. We've seen him go to Australia in the context of a very difficult situation there and pledge $3 billion to the GCF and say again that a deal is both possible and necessary in 2015. So, and then we've seen more recently President Obama come to India and focus again on the issue of climate change. We badly needed American leadership in the past. We have been critical of the Americans that they haven't done enough. President Obama is doing it. The jury is still out on how sustainable this will be because still doesn't have a Congress and a Republican Party that is very supportive of his efforts. But that leadership was vital. We spoke about China, and China has itself spoken about capping its emission by 2030. The European Union is speaking about cutting greenhouse gases by a minimum of 40% in the next decade or so. So we believe that the momentum that led to Copenhagen, that although Copenhagen itself was disappointing in its results, that momentum is building back towards Paris, that you have key elements and big players willing to step up and argue for an agreement. And that is the first signal that we needed. The second thing is Lima itself. Lima was successful in many regards by having a text ready, and I think it's a good stage from which to get to Paris. However, there are still things that we have to work on. We cannot become starry-eyed that this agreement will happen by itself. If we want the agreement to deliver the results that we all want, we have to now work on the building blocks. And sometimes in the declarative statements and in many of the speeches that proving the case over and over, the science of climate change and the necessity to do something and what countries declaratively are doing, that we lose sight of the building blocks, the heavy lifting that we need to do to get to a good agreement. So I believe that there are some elements we have to work on before before Paris. The first is the INDCs. This is positive. For the first time, all the countries in the world, which came out of Lima, for countries will have to make commitments. They will have to explain those commitments. And for the developing world itself, many of these countries have not thought through the issue of climate change. And by preparing the INDCs, I think this is an opportunity to get them, many of the small countries that I have interacted with in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the other countries, to get policymakers for the first time to focus on the issue of climate change in a nationwide context. So they will have to decide what their levels of commitments would be, how they're going to achieve those commitments, what sectors those commitments are going to come from, how those will impact on national growth or welfare in the country. And I think that if the developing world, particularly the developing world, were to go through this exercise in the manner that it should be gone through, then they can set commitment levels which might be different from their ambition, and then argue that the difference between their commitments and their ambition has to be financed. So, positive outcome of preparing these indices would be forcing the countries to think through the issues first of all. I know the 14 countries of the Caribbean, none of them have gone through the climate issues in a manner that is required by the INDCs. They know what the impact anecdotally will be. They know that a hurricane can wipe out the equivalent of 60% of GDP or 75% of GDP in a overnight, but they have not thought through the issues detailedly. So I believe that if we were to do this and to get these commitments in very early, then we would, into the UNFCCC process, we would be establishing a baseline for help. The second issue is the whole issue of financing. And I think we all know now that Lima was short on financing. The developed world cannot think that it will get everyone to pledge, as we have all promised to do through the INDCs, and then walk away from the table not addressing the issue of financing. And $10 billion to the GCF is simply not adequate when you look at what is required to achieve the results we want. It is not adequate. So unless that issue is solved, Paris may get an agreement with a legal outcome. It may get an agreement with ambition, high ambitions even, although I'm doubtful about that. But it will not be an agreement that the developing countries will buy into if it doesn't include finance. And if anyone thinks that they're going to walk away from this issue, it's not going to, there would be no valid agreement or credible, legitimate agreement. So we need to stimulate a process even now to start talking about how we will raise $100 billion by 2020. A few years back, the UN Secretary General appointed a group, a high-level advisory group. I was part of that group with some others, and we did a report that showed that it was possible to raise $100 billion per annum. We looked at several issues, alternative financing, and that report is available. If there is political will, again, it comes back to the issue of political will, $100 billion can be raised easily per annum without it all coming from the treasuries of the developed world, because that is a big concern. They do not believe that public financing should be used in every case. So I would urge you to look at that report. But these are the two things that I think that are important. The INDCs and doing it early, and secondly, financing an issue. If we can resolve some of these issues before Paris, I believe that the Paris Agreement will form the basis for changing the trajectory from this destructive one we're on. If it doesn't, even if it has a low ambition level, because we can use bilateral agreements, US-China bilateral, US-India bilateral, to raise the level of ambition beyond what is legally agreed there. But if it doesn't include financing, then there would be no credible agreement. It would simply not work. And so I just want to forewarn, because in the euphoria about the rebuilding of momentum to Paris, many countries and delegations believe they can just get away with a good agreement by making pledges. It's not going to be a good agreement. There has to be the issue of financing tackled. And the earlier we start working towards that, then, and looking at alternative sources, not just the treasuries of the developed countries, then the better the agreement with. It is propitious that I'm sharing the floor with a former Prime Minister of Norway, because we have used climate finance, an agreement with Norway on the forest, the sale of forest carbon, to catalyze in Guyana an entire series of low-carbon investments and to almost shift the trajectory of our development to a low-carbon trajectory. We set out to prove that there is a path to development that is not polluting, that you don't have to use the traditional polluting path to development, and that you can do so without compromising welfare. And so the funds garnered from the sale of forest carbon to Norway has been used, say, for example, to catalyze a big investment of about $850 million, most of it in private flows, to build a hydropower that has a tiny footprint, carbon footprint on the forest, but will supply over 90% of our power needs. We're using that to transform the economies of 165 villages where indigenous people live, so that they don't have to rely on cutting trees for welfare and for their prosperity. And that's the only way you'd save the forest, not by philanthropy or handout, but creating alternatives for people. We're using these funds to build a center for biodiversity studies so that we can export a new product, educational services, and a whole range of other things, adaptation, etc. So climate funds can present huge opportunities for developing countries to, in a new growth model, can help to catalyze change. But unfortunately, until now, a lot of those funds are not flowing in spite of the many charts you see and the graphs about disbursements. I chaired a committee that did a report for the Commonwealth Secretary General that I presented to the Commonwealth heads of government about climate financing for small countries. And there's a huge gap between perception and reality about how much money actually flows to these countries. And so I'm not going to get into that now, but if money flows to the countries through those are climate funds, but in a transparent manner, in a dedicated manner, it could help a lot of the developing countries address many, many of their concerns and even deal with resource management. I spoke with some Africans in FAO recently, and they said, we get advice piled on about how to manage our resources every single day. But if we don't have enough money to buy a vehicle for the forester to go out and to stop people cutting the trees, or to even buy a motorcycle for him to get out of the Forestry Commission, how are we going to manage the resources of the forest? They don't even have money in those agencies. So climate funds generally, coming back to the team, can be used for transformational purposes. They represent a huge opportunity for the developing world to grow and to create welfare, etc. But those have to be available. And currently, they're not available at the scale that is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jagdeo, and you struck an optimistic note when you said that the momentum for a climate accord, which seemed to have been lost after Copenhagen, has been regained in the past year owing to the involvement of big players, and in particular mentioned President Obama. And you also spoke about the two critical issues which will come up at Paris, the question of INDCs and how this presents an opportunity to developing countries to think through in policy terms about the entire issue of climate change as it relates to their countries. And secondly, the critical role of finance. And you also pointed to the role of the Commission, of which you were a member, which actually showed that it is possible to raise $100 billion a year, as had been indicated in the Copenhagen Climate Accord. And you also gave some examples of how forest carbon payments have actually helped Guyana to transform the lives of people in the villages, lives of indigenous peoples in the villages. Now let me throw the floor open for questions.
The way it comes across, listening to you, sir, is that it's really just a question of financing. And should the financing become available, everything else is done. You know, Norway's sovereign wealth fund has, how much is it, sir? About $1 trillion now in it. You know, they could just hand over $90 billion for good works on climate change. But do we really believe that that is the problem? Is financing the issue? I don't think so. I don't think that we even need to discuss $100 billion, the availability of $100 billion, if there are good projects on the table, which have a return, which are measurable, which can be finished on time, and which will give results, you know, which are aligned with climate change goals. I think the real problem is the capacity of developing governments to deliver. And that is not something that can go away in 2 years. Everyone knows capacity development, institutional change is a matter of 30 years. So are we missing the wood for the trees?
I think you made your point. I think Dr. Jagdeo would like to respond first.
Okay. I find it offensive sometimes that every time the developed world speaks about developing countries, they always believe that it's a capacity issue. We don't have capacity to fix something, so what would help us is the World Bank giving us $2 million that we have to jump through hoops to get to build capacity. What is needed often is financing at scale. Had we started in Guyana with this whole issue of capacity building, we would have never reached agreement with Norway. We had an enlightened country that said, let us together work at building the capacity. And I know many countries in the, so let me get through this one first. And we said, what do we want to work at? Our Forestry Commission doesn't have the capacity to track the change in forest carbon. But we are going to work together to build a world-class MRV system. We work together, we build a world-class MRV system, and we can track minute changes in the forestry. We didn't have that capacity. But that capacity was built as we were attracting financing at scale. So in the Caribbean, people have limited budgets. If you have to divert, most of these countries are fiscally stressed. They're running budget deficits of 10% of GDP. If they have to divert funds from their budgets now, so from education and healthcare, to go into building adaptation purposes, building schools that can resist a hurricane, or a hospital that can resist a hurricane, then it comes at the expense of welfare. These countries are running huge deficits. Their economies are monoculture in nature, tourism or financial sector, and both are in trouble when there is a recession in the developed world. So you have to understand the nature of these countries. Financing for them is vital to address these, and not financing for capacity alone, but financing to build things, to actually do things. So that's all. Yeah.
My question goes towards the opportunities for developing countries in these climate change negotiations. So my basic question is, what are the platforms are you providing actually before the Paris meeting for the young people to voice out their own concerns about this climate change issue?
You raise a very important issue because I think process is as important as content. I think organization of the COPs is vital. Copenhagen, I think, partly failed because of poor organization. You had heads of state and many delegations sitting in a room. I saw leaders of big countries in the world just sitting around waiting, not knowing what was happening for hours, 5-6 hours in a room. Whilst there was a little discussion somewhere else taking place, and that subsequently came out with the agreement, and it had to be baptized. Mexico made a serious effort to involve countries. The Mexican government sent out delegations to the smallest countries of the world, across the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in Africa, talking to people, listening to them, finding out from them. They felt involved. I think Peru did the same thing. And so if there's one thing we can say to the French government, that pay attention to the process leading up. Try to get as many opinions, voices, etc. Now, in many developing countries, it's almost esoteric. A small group goes off to the negotiations. They do not do much consultation at the national level. So I don't know how many opportunities there are for young people to contribute to the working out of national positions. In Guyana, what we did with our low-carbon development strategy, we sent out about 90% of the country, maybe 95% have cell phones. So we sent a text to everyone, please read the low-carbon development strategy. We had 300 public meetings in schools, etc. And we have talking to people about it. We have a steering committee that was chaired by the president. I chaired it. The current president chairs it too. That included women, young people, labor movement, the private sector, indigenous peoples organization. And we met once a week to look at the elements of the low carbon strategy. So involvement of people. You're right on, you should involve as many people as possible, the NGOs, etc. Because then it gives it legitimacy, any agreement that comes out of it.
Just a brief comment. It is one of my experiences when working with democracy assistance projects in developing countries, that in several countries, the political leaders are living very often in more or less isolation from common people and from the youth as well. So it is a challenge in many frameworks, also with regard to the important debate about the climate change, to change that attitude. I'm used to from Norway that we as politicians were living very close to common people, and we met them many times a week through NGOs and public meetings and reaching out to them. So to change the situation in several countries concerned, to bring people in a dialogue with the political leaders is of crucial importance. It's a real challenge. And it has to be done also with regard to the discussion about climate change, of course. Without, we don't get any concrete result. Because many people believe that climate change and environmental challenges is a debate for experts and not for us. This attitude must be changed.
I'm Praveen Verma from Terry. Sir, I have a basic doubt. Now, because of the demographic profile, the manufacturing from developing countries is being done of the developed countries. Now, that means the carbon footprint which I have available for my needs gets reduced because I end up producing Apple phones, whereas I need maybe real apples or food for my starving millions. So the growth which is available to me gets reduced, whereas for the developed countries, this excess is available, as also the capital flows back to the developed countries. Don't you think that whatever the negotiations take place on the carbon footprints should be based on actual consumption within the country rather than the total production? Thank you, sir.
Okay, so this is actually, in a sense, suggesting a paradigmic shift that you base countries' obligations on the consumption, on the embodied carbon in the consumption, rather than on the production. And this, of course, is a very live debate, but I think our two distinguished panelists might like to address this question.
Well, there are several models. You have a carbon budget model, you have a consumption-based model, taxing products that based on their carbon intensity. There are several approaches to this issue. But clearly, addressing the problem requires changes, commitment on the part of everyone, but a greater commitment on the part of the developed world that has a greater capacity to address the problem, and that caused the problem in the first place. We're not trying to apportion blame here because it's a common fate, but that's a reality. They do have a greater capacity to address the problem. In many of the developing countries, there is no even a social welfare system or a social welfare. So this is all that we're asking, that those who have a greater capacity to address the problem contribute more, both in terms of pledges and in financing. That is, I think that's the essence of the problem. But you can find various models on which you base those issues without shifting the burden to the developing world of addressing this problem. The model must not do that.
First of all, I think it's so important to emphasize that all countries of the world have to contribute. We have a common challenge and we have a common responsibility, no doubt. But as I also touched upon in my intervention, the developing countries has created a smaller part of the climate problem, but they get most of the serious consequences. So it's obvious that developed countries and a rich country like Norway, we have a special duty to contribute to resolve these problems. So this debate about the burden sharing is an important debate at all international conferences, and I assume also now the upcoming conference in Paris. But I think nobody can believe that we can escape in a way and do not contribute. That will be a failure.
We now have to conclude this session because we are well over our allotted time. So let me thank both our panelists and request a round of applause for our two distinguished panelists. Thank you.